The chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Before I deliver my opening remarks, I wanted to note that today the committee is meeting both in person and virtually, and I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of this hearing. First, members and staff who are attending in person and who are unvaccinated against COVID-19 need to stay masked throughout the hearing. Unvaccinated members may remove their masks only during their questioning under the 5-minute rule, or of course, unvaccinated persons can also attend remotely. Members who are attending virtually should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones, and please also keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking. And finally, if members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk whose email address was circulated prior to the hearing. I want to say good morning and thank Chairwoman Johnson for agreeing to hold this hearing. She is in her district with the First Lady of the United States today, and I am honored to be able to chair this hearing on wildlife fire science, and I think it's very clear that in the 2021 fire season, we've already had that begin. It's on pace to be much worse than last year. Already over 100,000 more acres of American wildland have burned than by this point in time in 2020. Firefighters in my home state of California are currently battling at least 6 large wildfires throughout the state. As a Californian, this is cause for alarm. In 2020 alone, the U.S. saw record wildfires burn 10 million acres of land, over 4 million of which were in California. In 2018, Californian fires only burned 2 million acres. The warmer and drier conditions created by climate change have increased extreme wildfire conditions, with 9 more days of high fire potential added every year since 2000. As the risk for catastrophic wildfire grows, so should our ability to forecast wildfires and to mitigate fire risk. Today's hearing presents an opportunity to discuss the current state of wildland fire research and how we can use it to improve our understanding of conditions in the field. We'll also discuss gaps in the science and identify opportunities for further federal investment and coordination. Federal programs like the U.S. Drought Monitor are instrumental in helping our wildland managers prepare for worsening fire seasons. This is just one example of how enhanced coordination among science agencies with operational managers can lead to actionable science. With dedicated authorities and investments in wildfire science, we can develop additional capabilities for real-time detection of fire ignition and even deepen our understanding of wildfire fuels. I was proud to co-sponsor an amendment with my colleague, Mr. Perlmutter, on wildfire resilience research funding in the NSF for the Future Act. It was great. It was a great start to what we can do to strengthen wildlife research, but we must do more. It's not right for Congress not to act to bolster our wildlife research. It's also dangerous. That's why I'm drafting legislation in this committee to improve the understanding, prediction, and management of wildland fires through robust research initiatives. This bill will also enhance federal interagency collaboration and coordination to include science agencies in federal wildland fire response. I hope this bill will also lead to our federal science agencies working closely with fire managers to ensure that wildfire science can be operationalized to mitigate wildfire risk. We are fortunate to have witnesses today whose testimony will inform this legislation. Joining us are academic researchers who use information provided by agencies like NOAA and NASA and the EPA to build out America's wildfire research capacity, and we look forward to hearing from them about opportunities for areas of further investment in wildfire science. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Craig Clements, who is a professor at, yes, San Jose State University, located in my congressional district. Dr. Clements is the director of San Jose State University's Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center, which is a leader in wildfire research. I look forward to hearing his testimony about the importance of supporting interdisciplinary wildfire research. We're also fortunate to have with us today some of the bravest people facing the wildfire crisis, our first responders, forest managers, and firefighters intimately understand which innovations best support on-the-ground needs. This hearing is a critical first step in creating a truly whole-of-government response to wildfire risk that connects research to operations. We're encouraged by the administration's emphasis on climate resilience and robust funding in the president's budget request for our science agencies to tackle extreme weather events. This leaves us ample room to work with appropriators to ensure funding levels in keeping with the magnitude of the wildfire challenges we face. With that, I want to thank our witnesses for their time this morning. And at this point, I would like to yield to the ranking member for any comments he may wish to make.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Chairwoman Johnson for holding this hearing and Chairwoman Lofgren for presiding today. Today's hearing is timely as we enter the summer months, which have traditionally marked the beginning of wildfire season. However, I'm sure many of my Western colleagues would agree that there is really not much of a true wildfire season anymore, with fires occurring year-round. Last year brought haunting images of devastating wildfires across the West. This year, unfortunately, could be even worse. The National Interagency Fire Center reports that the number of fires and acres burned to date are ahead of last year's figures. Given the ongoing drought covering much of the West, it's reasonable to conclude this year's wildfire statistics could be historic. Wildfire is an important part of the ecosystem and often occurs naturally. Many plant species rely on wildfire for their growth and regeneration processes, and many animal species look to recently burned lands for their habitat. However, lengthier droughts, hotter temperatures, and poorly maintained federal lands are all contributing to a greater frequency and intensity of wildfires across the country and around the world, which is problematic. Additionally, the increased number of people who live in the wildland urban interface, the area where residential neighborhoods meet wooded areas, has created the need for a different allocation of resources. While wildfires represent a threat to life and property, they also have devastating environmental impacts, ranging from polluted watersheds to increased carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere. We tend to think of the West as being the most vulnerable to wildfire, but this is an issue for all of us. Resources spent combating wildfire by our federal land management agencies are resources that could be spent on revenue-generating recreational activities and are a diversion of attention away from other local emergency response needs. Several agencies within our committee's jurisdiction have a role in combating wildfire, whether it's NASA providing Earth imaging data or NOAA's incident meteorologist helping firefighters plot the best path to fight an ongoing fire. Other agencies such as NSF and NIST engage in research on different aspects of wildlife behavior and how we can better fireproof structures. But we must be certain that all the work of these agencies is carried out in a coordinated manner and is being effectively put into operation by agencies such as the Forestry Service and the Department of Interior. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. I'm especially pleased to welcome George Geisler, who's currently the Washington State Forester. He previously was the State Forester of Oklahoma and can speak to the impacts of wildfire in different parts of the country. I look forward to hearing his thoughts on where there are gaps in federal research, how we can improve coordination among federal agencies, and what actions we can take which would be the most beneficial to him and all the on-ground wildfire responders. I know this is a busy period for him, especially given the record-breaking temperatures most of the West faced this past week, and I thank him for taking time to share his extensive experience with the committee. With that, Madam Chair, I want to thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and without objection, other members who wish may submit opening statements to the record. I'd now like to introduce our witnesses, all of whom are participating remotely. Our first witness today is Dr. Craig Clements. Dr. Clements is a professor of meteorology at San Jose State University and the director of the Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center. He leads research on fire, weather, extreme fire behavior, fire atmosphere interactions, and conducting wildland fire field experiments. Dr. Clements has over 20 years of experience in the meteorological field observations and teaches courses in fire weather, wildfire science, mountain meteorology, climate change, and meteorological instrumentation. Our next witness is Dr. Jessica McCarty. Dr. McCarty is the director of the Geospatial Analysis Center and as of July 1st of this year, an associate professor of geography at Miami University of Ohio. Dr. McCarty has more than 15 years experience in applications of geospatial and data science to accurately quantify wildland and human-caused fire emissions, agriculture and food security, and land cover land use change. She is the co-author of more than 30 peer-reviewed journal articles, 12 peer-reviewed conference proceedings, 3 book chapters, 4 technical reports, 4 data citations, and 1 NASA technology transfer. Our third witness, as has been mentioned by the ranking member, is Mr. George Geisler, who is Washington State Forester, and he's the Deputy Supervisor for Wildfire and Forest Health, having previously served in Oklahoma. He has almost 30 years of experience in natural resource and wildland fires, fire management, and 6 years of experience in structural firefighting as a volunteer in Idaho and New Mexico. He is a member of the Society of American Foresters since 1987 and a certified forester. He joined the Oklahoma Forestry Services in 2006. Before being named a state forester, he served in a staff function to coordinate all forest management activities provided by the agency. And our fourth and final witness today is Chief Eric Litzenberg, recently retired from his position as fire chief for Santa Fe County, New Mexico. Chief Litzenberg served the majority of his career in the City of Santa Fe Fire Department, completing his time in the city as fire chief and city manager before returning to the county where his career began. Through 25 years of service, he has also worked for New Mexico State Forestry and as part of multiple incident management teams, and for many years owned Santa Fe Wildfire, which provided resources for large-scale incident management and response. As our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your entire written testimony will be included in the record of this hearing. When you have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. There will be, I believe, a little clock on your virtual screen that will count down your 5 minutes. And when your 5 minutes are up, we do ask that you sum up so that we can hear all the witnesses before votes are called. So first, we will start with you, Dr. Clements.
Good morning, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee, including San Jose State's Representative Congresswoman Lofgren, who is chairing this hearing today. Thank you for inviting me to provide testimony on this very important issue. My name is Craig Clements, and I serve as Director of the Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center at San Jose State University. I'm honored to appear before the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee for this hearing on the state of federal wildland fire science, examining opportunities for further research and coordination. My testimony will focus on fire weather and fire behavior research and the need for additional federal investment in wildland fire science. At the outset, I'd like to thank Congresswoman Lofgren for advocating for increased wildfire investments across the federal government in her letter to the Biden administration. There is no doubt that wildfires are becoming larger and more severe in Western U.S. This trend is projected to continue due to a number of factors, including 100 years of fire exclusion that resulted in increased tree density and dead fuel accumulation, and longer fire seasons and changes in fire weather conditions caused by climate change. Now more than ever, our nation needs to increase investment in fire science to empower decision makers in addressing the complex challenges we face. While I won't address all research gaps in wildland fire science today, I will focus on a few key aspects that I believe are important. Fundamental mechanisms of wildfire spread are still poorly understood, especially in the context of extreme events. Additionally, we don't have a good understanding of what role fire-atmosphere interactions play on fire spread, nor do we have the appropriate observations to tackle these questions. There's a wide gap between the need for high-resolution data to understand fire behavior and the current capabilities of fire observation systems. In terms of observational needs, we need to start treating fire weather the same as we do other severe weather phenomena. We don't have the same levels of funding or dedicated resources for fire weather as we do for severe storms or hurricane research. We need the equivalent of hurricane hunters for wildfire so that we can better see and sample the fire. Additionally, we are missing the appropriate sensors for critical observations. Specifically, we need publicly available, high spatial and temporal resolution observations from both space and aircraft. These observations can't just be a snapshot once or twice a day. They need to be continuous over the entire event. Comprehensive observational data sets that include fire weather, plume dynamics, smoke, and fire behavior are rare. The Fire and Smoke Model Evaluation Experiment, called FASME, which is a multi-agency program, addresses these data gaps by capitalizing on high-intensity prescribed fires, and this should be a national priority. In terms of the prediction of fire behavior, investment is needed in operational, community-based coupled fire atmosphere models, which are models that link the fire spread with a weather prediction forecast. These are the only models that can best predict how a fire can create its own weather. A community-based model is even more important because it allows researchers from any institution to not only use the model, but to also improve the model and share it with other users. This is in contrast to models that are kept in-house and within one agency, institution, or national lab that are not available for other agencies or institutions to use or contribute to. For example, the Open Wildfire Modeling Group facilitated development of the first community fire atmosphere model called WRF-S-Fire. This model has become a core forecasting system used by many institutions and agencies around the world. Further investment in this framework will improve our ability to better predict extreme future fire. In terms of driving the science forward and promoting innovation, directed funding to agencies that support research and development in the wildfire science needs to be a priority. A few federal agencies are already leading wildfire research efforts, but these are not well coordinated. One exception is the Joint Fire Sciences Program that's had its budget reduced in half. Restoring its budget and even increasing it will benefit wildland fire science. Federal investment should also target competitive grant programs that academic institutions can apply for. For example, the National Science Foundation could develop specific wildfire funding programs across its directorates that would fund not only basic research, but also provide more mechanism for research within the social sciences. And finally, and most importantly, in my opinion, is the need to establish a national and sustainable fire weather research program. To date, there's never been a dedicated program that funds both basic and applied research in fire weather, and this is critically needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clements. We will now turn to our next witness, Dr. McCarty. We're pleased to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, Chairwoman Lofgren, and Ranking Member Lucas, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity to appear today to discuss research and coordination.
Switch device.
For federal wildfire science. I am Dr. Jessica McCarty, and as of July 1, I am an associate professor of geography at Miami University of Ohio. I have more than 15 years experience in applications of satellites to quantify wildland and human-caused fires and related emissions, including as a member of the 2019 NOAA-NASA Fire XAQ field campaign. During my testimony, I will highlight the relationship between climate change and wildfires, options to reduce fire risk, solutions for satellite-based detection and monitoring, as well as federal wildfire science collaboration. The opinions expressed in my testimony are my own and do not represent views of Miami University. As Dr. Clements has pointed out previously, climate change means warmer temperatures for the entire U.S., witnessed in the increased fire intensity and drier fuel conditions of the western states. Climate change increases drought, leading to large stands of dry and sometimes dead trees. This accelerates the likelihood of extreme fires, even in our eastern forests, like the 2016 Great Smoky Mountains fire near Gatlinburg, Tennessee, that burned over 17,000 acres and killed 14 people during an exceptional drought. Within the boreal and Arctic regions of Alaska, climate change will increase lightning activity, will trigger a transition from boreal forests to more fire-prone grasslands, and will dry out peatlands, causing long-lasting underground fires that will span multiple fire seasons. Wildfires contribute to climate change by being a source of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. More frequent and intense wildfires now and in the future can potentially lower our forest's ability to capture carbon by reducing forest density and tree size. Research into mitigating future wildfire risk should note that mitigating any wildfire risk means reducing carbon emissions and preventing further warming. Since we cannot prevent lightning strikes and as we work to limit warming, our remaining options are to reduce human-caused ignitions and to modify fuels. Human-caused ignitions in the western U.S. account for 84% of all wildfires. In a warmer and more flammable future, we must act to reduce arson, accidental fires, and the spread of open burning from agricultural fields to wildlands. And research in those areas will assist in those actions. Wildfire risk can be lowered through fuels reduction. This is most effectively done via prescribed burning, as well as working with indigenous fire practitioners to return cultural burning to the land. A community's tolerance for smoke will often dictate when or if a prescribed fire occurs, and social science research into those community reactions is needed. The choice is ours. Do we tolerate a few hours of smoke, or do we wait until we are forced to evacuate? Spaceborne fire detections often rely on 375 meter to 1 kilometer resolution polar orbiting satellites, which are overhead 2 to 4 times per day, as Dr. Clements mentioned. A higher resolution sensor like the 30-meter Landsat is only overhead every 16 days, but the pixel sizes are about the size of a baseball diamond. Geostationary systems like NOAA's GOES R series have 0.5 to 2 kilometer pixels, so think 3 by 3 city blocks to 11 by 11 city blocks. But they capture images every 5 to 15 minutes. Improved wildland fire detection, monitoring, and research needs combined higher spatial and temporal resolution sensors. NOAA's GeoXO gets us closer to such a system. But the first launch is currently planned for the early 2030s. We need this now. Being able to see new fire ignitions and fire spread every 15 minutes within baseball diamond-sized grids would be a game changer for science, for fire management and incident command, and for public education and engagement, including improved warning systems. Finally, I would be remiss not to mention as well the Joint Fire Science Program. The JFSP is a solutions-oriented federal research collaboration that provides scientific funding for practical results. But the JFSP also funds and manages the Fire Science Exchange networks. These 15 regional fire science exchanges provide the most relevant and current wildland fire science to federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders across all 50 states. Currently, the funding for and future of the JFSP and the regional exchanges is in question. We should not reinvent the wheel when a functioning and successful federal mechanism that collaborates with non-federal partners at all levels already exists. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll turn to our next witness, Mr. Geisler. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Good morning, Chairwoman Lofgren and Ranking Member Lucas and distinguished members of the committee. My name is George Geisler, State Forester and Deputy Wildland Fire and Forest Health for the Washington Department of Natural Resources. I'm past president of the National Association of State Foresters, chair of NASF's Wildland Fire Committee, and a member of the Wildland Fire Leadership Council. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today as the committee examines opportunities for further research and coordination related to wildland fire science. State forestry agencies such as DNR contribute a significant portion of the overall wildland fire suppression effort nationally in terms of resources, personnel, capacity, and funds. Each year, state and local agencies respond to the majority, roughly 80% of all wildfires across all jurisdictions. And state foresters work closely with conservation districts, mayors, local and county governments, tribal and federal partners across the U.S. to deliver forestry programs and wildfire protection on a national scale. We appreciate the work of this committee to address this important issue, and in the interest of time, I will highlight the following recommendations for improving research and development efforts focused on supporting wildland fire management. First, Please support research and development on wildland fire
Like I
behavior
have it on
modeling
like the coldest temperature
in the
it should
wildland
be on.
urban
Whoever is
space.
There is an air in the
Better
hallway.
real-time
Now it's like
wildfire
now.
modeling would benefit wildland fire response efforts and
Okay,
would be
you wanna make
made
some calls?
accessible to the general public.
Yeah,
We
in
have
the
good
hallway,
predictive
it's fucking
services
hot.
now, but there is a clear need for real-time wildfire modeling at the operational level to inform response. As an example, the National Hurricane Center uses many models as guidance in the preparation of official track and intensity forecasts for hurricanes. Forecast models vary tremendously in structure and complexity. Similar tools would combine a collection or ensemble of wildfire models in real time to provide an advantage for wildland fire operations and better inform the public. Second, please support the development of fire simulation models that incorporate the built environment as a fuel. Currently, wildfire models encompass the wildlands and stop at the built environment to better determine future threats to communities in the WUI. Trees and grasses burn very differently from homes and our businesses. Please support research and development that enables remote tracking of all active wildfire suppression resources in real time. Wildfire management and suppression operations utilize a patchwork of communication networks to track resources. We need to develop a standardized system for accountability and tracking of resources and develop an implementation schedule for integration of the system into the interagency environment. We need to improve the capacity for early detection and assessment of wildfires, particularly in rural areas. Oftentimes, in many areas, including my own state of Washington, wildfires can go undetected for days. And we now rely more and more on citizens to report wildfires through typical 911 calls. More access to satellite technology and high-performance infrared cameras would greatly improve early detection and assessment. And attacking wildfires early and when they're small is the key to reducing fatalities, injuries, loss of natural resource, property damage, and lowering our firefighting costs. Also, we ask you prioritize the development of real-time smoke modeling and decision support tools for wildland fire managers and local and regional public health officials. There are opportunities to leverage the resources of the EPA and Centers for Disease Control to better understand the public health impacts of smoke on people, including our wildland firefighters. With many wildfires occurring in the WUI, there are more materials and chemicals in homes and in the streets that burn and produce a very toxic environment. We ask you to provide research opportunities that will help inform the development and implementation of the next generation of national, state, and local codes and standards for addressing WUI issues and catastrophic wildfire risk. This research should utilize the best available science and include the review of past wildfire losses. And finally, we ask you to develop a standard of warning scale for wildfires that actually conveys the magnitude or potential magnitude of current developing and projected wildfire events. This scale, much like the enhanced Fujita scale for tornadoes or the Richter scale for earthquakes, would help convey the magnitude of the threat to the public and could be used to improve evacuations and emergency preparations. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today on behalf of Washington's Department of Natural Resources and the National Association of State Foresters. Improvements in applied research and development technologies that support wildfire management will greatly enhance our collective ability to safely respond to wildfire and better protect our communities and treasured natural resources. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now for our final witness, Chief Litzenberg, we'd be pleased to hear from you.
Good morning, Chairwoman Johnson, Chairwoman Lofgren, and Ranking Member Lucas, as well as members of the committee. I am Eric Litzenberg, recently retired fire chief in Santa Fe County Fire Department. I currently serve as chair of the Wildland Fire Policy Committee of the International Association of Fire Chiefs. I appreciate the opportunity today to discuss the state of federal wildland fire science in the future. Wildland fires are now an all-year threat to every state, and as my previous panelists, as well as members of the committee have stated, the statistics continue to rise. This year probably looks to be the worst on record. Local fire departments are on the front lines. We prepare our communities for fires and are often the first to respond. We help evacuate communities. When the fire is over, we help the communities recover and address threats that often follow, such as flooding, debris flows, and landslides. While federal agencies like the U.S. Forest Service and FEMA play the most visible role in responding to wildland fires, federal research agencies like NASA, NOAA, NIST, and NSF provide tools to help prevent and fight future wildland fires. They currently provide research and tools such as fire weather predictions, satellite imagery, predictive fire analysis, research in building codes, community fire prevention, post-fire analysis, and studies of major catastrophic fires and their aftermath. Greater federal research into satellites, climate, and technology can revolutionize preparedness and response. As we adapt to new technology like unmanned aircraft systems, we can provide the incident commanders on scene with a host of new tools. Most importantly, we can develop an integrated picture. This will allow us to effectively save lives and property in the face of a growing wildland fire problem. As federal researchers focus on the national wildland fire problem, I'd like to highlight some emerging fields of research and technology for them to consider. Ground-based airborne and satellite remote sensing systems can provide an integrated early warning system and better picture of the incident. Satellites can identify fires in low-density areas and near critical infrastructure. Also, remote sensing can be used to provide information about fuels and droughts. Fire mapping can be used to prevent and mitigate wildland fires. These maps can guide hazardous fuels and other mitigation projects. They also can provide real-time and interactive maps to assist incident commanders during a fire. Remote sensing data and risk maps can be used to provide predictive analytics. This information can be used to identify at-risk areas and focus community preparedness and mitigation efforts. UAS provides several capabilities. They can hover over a fire to track its progress. Infrared cameras can be used to identify hotspots, and they can provide a wealth of real-time data to the firefighters in the field. The development of a firefighter location tracking system would be a game changer. The creation of a practical firefighter tracking tool could improve firefighter safety and reduce the number of deaths and injuries that occur each year. The IFC recommends that the U.S. Forest Service, FEMA, NOAA, and NIST work with the Wildland Fire Leadership Council to develop a standard warning system for wildland fires, much like the Richter scale for earthquakes. A standardized warning system would help emergency managers and the public act as a fire develops. Federal agencies should develop a standardized data collection system. This includes uniform formatting and methodology to capture and report wildland fire data, including information about mitigation, prevention, and post-recovery efforts. Effective communication systems are the glue that link all of these opportunities together. Unfortunately, we're still facing problems with coverage and interoperability. It will be crucial to address this problem to take advantage of the new tools under development. I would like to highlight FirstNet's role in focusing on building out a nationwide public safety broadband network. These capabilities offer potential, but they must be integrated effectively before incidents occur and on scenes. So the federal agencies should work with the Forest Service and Department of Interior, but they should also work with state, tribal, territorial, and local partners. There are opportunities like WIFLIC and NIFC to have these discussions. In addition, they should work with non-governmental organizations such as the IFC. Prioritization of at-risk communities can guide community preparedness efforts like the IFC's Ready, Set, Go program. In addition, the National Fire Academy, IFC, and other educational and media organizations can partner with the federal researchers to get information and technology to the practitioners. The wildland fire problem is a national challenge. The IFC looks forward to working with the committee to mobilize our resources for this fight. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you very much for your testimony and to all the witnesses for your testimony. At this point, we will give members of the committee an opportunity to ask questions of our witnesses for about 5 minutes, and I will begin with myself. My constituents and the constituents of many of us on this committee have been dealing with severe wildland or mega fires in recent years. And in fact, the wildland fires has grown from a season to really all year round. We had fires in California in the winter. And, in a way, I think about, yes, there are wildland fires, but they also impact urban areas. I'll never forget visiting Santa Rosa in 2017, a little town, not in the middle of a forest, and the fire came in and destroyed 5% of the housing in that suburban community. It's going to a suburb and all the houses are gone. The shopping center is burned down. Going, with Representative Thompson, who represents that area, to other areas of his district that just was burned, and the fire in Paradise, 2018. Doug Lamalfa represents that area. The fire swept through, and the entire town was also destroyed. So obviously, we have important steps to take. I'm interested in how we can enhance collaboration and coordination across the federal government, along with, the operational stakeholders on the front line. So Dr. Clements and Dr. McCarty, as academic researchers who rely on federal data and resources, where should the federal investment in wildfire science be most urgently directed? First, you, Dr. Clements.
I thank you. So I think that funding these programs across all the agencies, particularly, I think what we really need to focus on is research focus, so we can get better information in terms of better tools. And so having new tools will allow us to build what we need in terms of sensor systems, because we're lacking those sensor systems, and also the fact that we need more platforms. Like was stated earlier, was the fact that we need better satellite technology. So I think an investment in a lot of satellite development would be really beneficial to the entire wildfire science community.
Dr. McCarty, do you have anything to add on that?
I would just add that we also need to think about, as we develop these tools, that we communicate them with the public in an effective way, and we also integrate their input. I think a lot of time when we think about wildfire risk and reducing wildfire risk, we forget that people are the main cause of fires still. And the more that we are transparent and open with the public, the better they will understand the risk and potentially act as good citizens to reduce that risk in the future. And that includes social science research, public health research, as was mentioned by some of the other witnesses. Thank you.
Are there opportunities for federal investment or direction that could have positive impacts in the short term? And how long do we think it will take for the longer term investments to have realized impacts? Dr. McCarty and then Dr. Clements.
So for satellite development, these things take a while. NASA's decadal surveys are a decade long for a reason. But oftentimes it's the funding and the priority that limits the advancement of these systems and implementation. And I agree also with federal investment in the Wildland Fire Leadership Council would also be needed so that it can interact with the incident command and the commanders on the field, and NIFC, as well as other agencies. And that's a short-term, high risk, high reward investment that could be done quickly within an off season to see if that implements better in the next fire season.
Dr. Clements, anything to add on that?
I think one thing that could happen quickly is that restoring the Joint Fire Science Program budget would allow researchers to just engage quickly, because that program actually funds things faster than a lot of federal agencies. The timing between proposal submission and project start is really quick. And so that could be one way to just jumpstart a lot of research quickly.
Mr. Geisler and Chief Litzenberg, I don't have much time left in my 5 minutes, but do you have anything to add to what's been said already?
Thank you. There is one statement I'd like to make, and I totally agree with the comments of my colleagues here on the panel. I would like to emphasize the application of that science also. There's a lot of really good work that's ongoing that will require just a little bit of funding and maybe increased collaboration between state, local, and federal agencies. And we could get this technology to the ground, to the firefighters, where it's going to make a difference. And so that interaction and collaboration, I find, is just something that we should foster and support as much as possible.
Thanks.
And I will add that echo for all three panelists, and I'll emphasize what George Geisler just said about integration. There are places where this integration is already happening effectively. And as science and data is created, it'll be important to get this to the boots on the ground, to the practitioners. And Wildland Fire Leadership Council and the National Interagency Fire Center, that integration is happening already. So small investments can be leveraged significantly.
Thank you very much. My time has expired, and I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And George and I think we've worked together long enough. I can call you George. You mentioned your testimony about, of course, listing several areas about how the committee could fill gaps and address shortfalls, and the chairwoman very appropriately went down that. Could you expand for a moment, thinking about from the committee's perspective, prioritizing those? Where particularly, George, if you had the ability to give us guidance, how would you prioritize 1, 2, 3, 4, if you don't mind?
No, I'd be glad to. Thank you, Representative Lucas. And yes, you can call me George anytime. The priorities when we're looking at it, I mean, I am very aware of a lot of the satellite technology and some of the early work that's been going on. In fact, in my time with Oklahoma Forest Service, we were working closely with the Severe Storms Lab, doing early detection and notification modeling. And I know that while there's long-term implications and development of the resource, currently there's a lot of opportunity just to get that on the ground right now, working with local agencies. The other piece that I would really like to emphasize is the firefighter and resource tracking. This is a safety issue, and there are a number of different systems that are out there right now. And to be able to monitor and track our resources in real time, ensuring that we are putting them in the best place as possible, ensuring that we're utilizing them effectively, and especially monitoring them to ensure that they are safe and that we are tracking and know that they're all going home. I think that that's just absolutely critical for us, and we could make the changes that are necessary there. It's a standardization process and an implementation process that really needs to occur. And the last one, though, for me is very much I know that there's a lot of work here, but it is something that I would sink my money into if I had to. And that's the discussion around real-time smoke modeling and continuing the decision space around that. Smoke is probably the greatest public health issue related to wildland fire. And knowing what that implications are, being able to work with the public to improve public health and firefighter health, in fact, I think is just part of that mission. And the CDC and EPA, along with several other regional smoke agencies, are doing some amazing work. And to kind of foster that even further would be a tremendous asset to us all.
You know my district, George, literally from the northeast corner of the state to the southwest corner, the northwest half of Oklahoma. And weather forecasting is very critical to my farmers because it's decisions about when to plant, apply fertilizer, harvest, utilize prescribed burns to help maintain the health of our rangelands. And one of the ways that my neighbors and my spouse engage in decision making is using Oklahoma's Mesonet system, which provides up to the minute weather data. How did you utilize the Mesonet data when you were State Forester of Oklahoma? And along with that, while you're thinking about it, do you believe that such a system should be emulated in other states to help benefit, prevent, and fight large-scale wildfires?
Yeah, the Mesonet system that Oklahoma has is such a unique resource for firefighters. We can watch in almost real time weather pattern changes, wind changes. I remember distinctly my fire chief counting down a wind shift to people in the field, telling them when it was going to occur, and he hit it within a minute because we were watching it all on a screen. When I worked in other parts of the country, especially if you go to places like here in Washington State, we struggle because there's so many microclimates and not enough monitors. But to be able to do that, to be able to talk to folks in real time and do the prediction that folks that have all of that data, like the Mesonet, that what the Mesonet system provides, was just unbelievably valuable to us in that environment, especially an environment that the type of fuels Oklahoma has. It's a rapidly changing fire scenario. They're very quick, fine fuels, and you have to know the wind very, very effectively to do it. In other parts of the country, when I get out, I do sometimes wax nostalgia about Mesonet, and having something to that effect across the United States would be amazing. And I think any fire manager that works in Oklahoma, is always thrilled by the app that we can easily download on our phones and do all of that. So it's an excellent tool. I agree.
Absolutely. The ability to protect both citizens' lives and their property. And I know there have been many occasions, as you've kind of alluded to, when volunteer fire alliance members have been moved in a hurry because they couldn't survive where they were. An amazing system. With that, thank you, George, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady from Oregon is now recognized, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you so much, Chair Lofgren, and thank you to Chair Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas for holding this hearing today, but especially thank you to our witnesses for bringing your expertise. I represent Northwest Oregon, and this past weekend, the Pacific Northwest faced a record-breaking heat wave with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees for multiple days. In fact, it was 115 degrees at home yesterday. These dangerous temperatures combined with a thin snowpack and below average precipitation are really raising alarms about our upcoming wildfire season. In fact, we have already seen a 6,200 acre fire on the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs Reservation in Central Oregon. Fortunately, it's been mostly contained, but Oregonians have become all too familiar with wildfires in recent years. Over Labor Day weekend just last year, rare, powerful winds and very dry conditions resulted in unprecedented wildfires across the state. Approximately 1 million acres burned. Lives were lost, homes and communities were destroyed. Hazy skies and smoky conditions made the air quality in Portland comparable to some of the most polluted places on the planet. Thank you, Mr. Geisler, for highlighting the health hazards of smoke. Our communities are really on the front lines of the climate crisis, and wildfires are yet another example of the need for comprehensive and bold climate action. So I want to ask you, Dr. Clements, you said we need to treat wildfires like other natural disasters and severe weather threats. And in your testimony, you noted the deficiencies in our understanding of how wildfires create their own weather and how fire atmospheric interactions can affect spread. So how would improving our understanding of fire weather help to mitigate or respond to wildfires? And how can Congress better direct federal agencies to conduct this important research?
Thank you. So yeah, the fire weather gap, a knowledge gap is really is a problem because we just don't put those resources to fire weather. Like I mentioned, thinking about the hurricane hunters. We don't have those resources for fire. Now we have suppression resources, tons of suppression resources. One thing we can do is we can instrument suppression aircraft with these tools, with the science tools. I've been advocating this for a while now, and it wouldn't be that hard because everything would be automated and we could actually just get all the information in real time. So harnessing the current platforms that are surrounding fires is really important. And I think what we're missing is that we can't, when we go to, so for example, my team, we go to active wildfires in California with Doppler radar and Doppler LiDAR. We're the only team in the US that can do that. There are no observations on active wildfires. It's not like there's storm chasers chasing fires. We're the small team and we get just a little bit of information here and there. We need to change that concept and make it more of a priority where we're actually supporting the incident meteorologists of the National Weather Service on these big fires. In addition, I think we could support, funding could be directed to NOAA for this type of infrastructure to support the incident meteorologists. They're tasked with forecasting very high resolution using models, but they don't have the observations on the fire. And some of these fires are so remote that we don't have the observations. In California,
really though, I don't want to cut you off, but I want to try to get in another question. Thank you so much. I want to ask Chief Litzenberg. Last year, I joined my colleagues on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis in releasing our bold science-based plan to reach net zero emissions no later than mid-century and net negative thereafter. The plan represents the first significant legislative proposal to address the need for climate resilience investments, including investing in wildfire risk mapping systems that integrate relevant data from federal agencies, states, and partners. So in your testimony, you noted the importance of risk mapping and real-time interactive maps. So what are the implications of the expansion of the wildland urban interface without high-resolution mapping? And how could better maps, including parcel-level data, better inform planning and response decisions?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. So that is the key to what we do. Getting good data and putting it in a way that's usable not only to our responders, but to those in the community who are working on the team that's doing prevention, doing mitigation, trying to make our communities safer. And as we have seen hotter, drier conditions, the risk areas have expanded. I will say that, and I said it in my testimony as well, one of the keys to me and my profession and my representation as a responder is that data becomes available as real time as possible to those that are on the ground doing the work. So there's application in both prevention and mitigation and predictive analysis and incident command and real-time situational awareness.
Thank you so much. My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Posey is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate you having a hearing on this. Mr. Geisler, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences issued a report entitled Human Presence Diminishes the Importance of Climate in Driving Fire Activity Across the United States. This report is significant because it found that climate was significantly less important where humans were more prevalent, suggesting that human influence could override or even exceed the effect of climate change on fire activity. And Madam Chair, I'd ask unanimous consent to submit this report for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. Based on your experience to prevent fires, should our limited resources be focused more or specifically on what and how we are building in fire zones rather than the broader topic of climate change? Mr. Geisler, I appreciate your response.
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate that. Actually, when we talk about fire and fire prevention, one of the earlier panelists mentioned the greatest numbers of fires are caused by humans, whether it be a spark or a campfire. We use the old Smokey Bear message of only you. Bottom line, though, is with development in urban areas, we're getting more people, and so you have more opportunities for fires to occur. It's not that they're not trying to prevent it, but it's just greater opportunities. In fact, in my own state of Washington, the West Side, while it does have forests that typically have a longer duration between fires because of the fuels types, that's where our biggest population is, and we are seeing significant fires there. But at the same time, if you look at our forests and our forest resiliency, climate has had an impact on that also. And so combining with they're both challenges, that's why a lot of what you see happening right now is an emphasis on working towards healthier forests, greater resiliency in those forests, and making them more fire adapted. So for me, it's really a two-pronged approach. There is the long term of we have to get our fuel situation under control. We have to be able to keep our landscapes resilient, whether it's a forest or a rangeland. But at the same time, there's an education process and a prevention process, which we have to get people to be aware of what they're doing, be able to prevent those fires. And then in our planning efforts, as people move into these beautiful areas, we have to get those areas better prepared for the interactions of the fires that will inevitably come. And I lost sound.
Can you hear us?
I cannot hear you anymore. I cannot hear the congressman.
How about that? Is this better?
That's better, sir. Thank you.
I'm asking if you'd be kind enough to explain why we need to include our, quote, built communities, those where we have built homes, roads, businesses, and schools in fire simulation models.
Easily, because as we see the roads and the homes being put into these areas, our models currently just look at it as a continuous layer of fuels. Basically, we look at it as trees and grasses. Homes and businesses, structures, all of these things change the fire behavior, change the way that fire acts on the landscape. Having that information, knowing how the reaction of the fire is going to be or the actual behavior of the fire is going to be, when it hits these communities is something that will better inform our firefighters and make them work safer and be able to suppress the fires a lot easier.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Geisler. Madam Chair, I see my time is about to expire. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barra of California is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and the ranking member. Obviously, this is a hugely important issue for us in California. If I think about why I love the state of California, from hiking in the backcountry as a Boy Scout when I was growing up to hiking the Sierra Nevadas and the Feather River, et cetera, camping out there. A lot of those places I've experienced and are now scarred by forest fires. And I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I'd ask the witnesses to keep their answers short and tight so I can get through a number of these. I want to make sure I understand, on the sensing side of this, I've heard a number of the witnesses talk about how we just haven't allocated the satellite resources necessary, because I don't think it's a technology issue. I think we have infrared sensing devices. We have the ability to put satellites in space so they're constantly monitoring areas 24/7. We have drone capabilities that could surveil these areas. So I want to make sure I understand it. It's not a technology issue. It's a resource allocation issue, if I get that correct. And maybe Mr. Clements, is that an accurate sense?
Yeah, so we can use CAL FIRE as an example. CAL FIRE has adopted the latest science and software package available, and it allows to track resources, firefighters. It puts the fire prediction model in there. And so it's the state of the science, and it's actually been very successful. So that information gets some DoD satellite fire guard data involved so they can map it. But those data aren't really applied to the research community. But yes, the resources, it's a resource issue. CAL FIRE has already adopted it, and it's very successful. They have a new system. It's for the whole state, and it's a really good model that should be used nationally.
Great, fantastic. So I think that's something we as a committee could work on in a bipartisan way. A question for Mr. Geisler. One area that I've worked on over the years is we have allocated resources to better forestry management, et cetera. But for years, we would do this thing called fire borrowing, where we would take those resources and then we'd actually spend them to fight the fires. I know we've tried to address the issue of fire borrowing. I suspect we could do more on the forestry management side to mitigate some of these forest fires. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. The fire borrowing issue was actually helped tremendously by some legislation that occurred a couple of years ago. Really, the emphasis right now needs to be to take those dollars and really force them onto the ground and making sure that they are being put into the highest priority areas that we have. A lot of times when we're doing forest management, I call them random acts of conservation, where a lot of it is kind of spread across the landscape, and prioritizing the funds, making sure that they get to the ground is something that we should all emphasize and work harder on.
Okay, great. And again, we were able to pass that legislation in a bipartisan way. So I think this is another area where we could work together as Democrats and Republicans, to really make sure we're actively managing our forests and mitigating some of these fires. Mr. Litzenberg, let me ask you a question. That 4 or 5 years ago, I had two of my local fire chiefs, who happened to be up in Washington, D.C. visiting, and just serendipitously, they started talking about the stresses that we're putting on our firefighters. And since then, I've talked to a number of. I represent a suburban urban community, but a lot of our firefighters rotate up into the hills to supplement CAL FIRE and help with these fires. So they're almost constantly working during fire season. And we put together a piece of legislation called the HEROES Act a few years ago, which is passed out of the House in this Congress, really identifying and trying to address the pressures and stress that are leading to firefighter suicide, firefighter PTSD, et cetera. If you could, just quickly comment on the stresses that the men and women are under, both urban and suburban, but also the folks that are in the forestry service.
Congressman, I really appreciate that question because, the stresses on our workforces at any level, all levels of government and private sector, is significant, and they are a full range from behavioral stressors all the way through physical stressors. The more that you ask from a workforce that's already strapped, the longer you ask them to serve in terms of hours in a day or in terms of weeks and months in a year. And the more exposures you give them to smoke and to human suffering, the greater stressors they have. So we've always appreciated investments in solutions, but we are only just beginning to discover the effects that these stresses have on our response force. They are significant.
Well, great. And we passed that legislation out of the House in a bipartisan way. Let's hope the Senate takes it up and sends it to the president's desk. Thank you. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Kim of California is now recognized.
Thank you, Chair Lofgren and Ranking Member Lucas for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for being with us today, too. Unfortunately, wildfires in my district and the rest of California, where Congressman Onibera and I are from, we seem to be more prevalent every year. And with 85% of California in extreme drought, the problem of longer wildfire seasons has been exacerbated by the dryness of our landscape and the record-breaking temperatures. And adding insult to injury, the wildfire smoke and ash negatively impacts our air quality and drinking water. And I will begin work in a bipartisan manner to better coordinate our federal efforts in predicting wildfires and adopt cutting-edge solutions to detect fires as soon as they start. Mr. Geisler, I represent California's 39th district, where we have unfortunately seen the devastating effects of wildfires, not only in my communities, but across the state of California. So how can we ensure coordination between federal, state, and local communities to share available information and tools to better predict and respond to wildfires?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. I appreciate it. The one thing that I will emphasize is that you really should be proud of the national system that we do have currently. The interaction that we have between federal, state, and local agencies is something that actually other countries come to try to duplicate. But there's always room for improvement. Getting to common operating systems, being able to share data, being able to share and communicate effectively is really some of the items that, if we can address those, it's critical. A lot of times it's just the difference between two computer systems or literally the links that we might be able to get through broadband that prevents some of the sharing. And so it sounds kind of basic, that the need, but the willingness and the ability to do it is there. A lot of times it is just making sure that the connections are made, whether it be introducing two people, literally just doing that, all the way to making sure that our systems link together and operate effectively. The system that was just described that CAL FIRE had is absolutely amazing. And it's in test, and it has been doing some great work. Part of the basis of that is its ability to start communicating across jurisdictional authorities. And that's what we're all looking for, is that ability to effectively share all of these resources that we currently have.
So NOAA has commenced the process of designing the next generation of satellites in its fleet. So have any of your colleagues engaged with NOAA in designing these satellites to improve wildfire detection abilities? If not, what advice would you give to NOAA to help make the future satellite fleet more effective in wildfire detection and prevention?
So I will say that I am unaware if any of my colleagues have worked directly with NOAA over satellites. I will tell you that in my past life, I was able to work with the National Severe Storm Labs in Norman, Oklahoma. And I know that the interaction between the National Weather Service and state agencies is very strong. And we utilize a lot of that satellite technology, and that there have been conversations about how effectively those could be used at the NOAA level also. But I'm unaware of anyone that is speaking directly to them. But I do agree it's a huge opportunity for us all.
So you're familiar with the experimental high-resolution rapid refresh smoke model?
Yes.
Have you had input on that development of any of these models? And in your opinion, what further research and development is needed to make existing models more effective?
Yeah, a lot of input has been really coordinated through the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, where we do have all of the partners at the table. So you not only have state foresters, but you also have mayors and other members of the various levels of government really having those discussions. So it's a really powerful forum to kind of discuss the needs and where we go forward. So going into the future, we're really looking again to try to enforce that and try to get more of the outreach. There's a very recent memo, even in fact, between CDC and EPA discussing wildfire smoke and actually being able to address all of the research and coordination that was there. And all of that was actually made possible through the interactions that we've had at that Wildland Fire Leadership Council. So again, it sounds like I'm a broken record related to potentially solving a lot of these problems, but there's basic funding we need for research. But then there's also just the social science of communication and then effectively making sure that we share resources across the table.
Thank you very much. I see my time is up, so I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens is now recognized.
Thank you, Chair Lofgren, for presiding over today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for your incredible written and spoken testimony. Your written testimonies in particular were quite inspiring, and I really enjoyed reading them. In Michigan, during this month alone, the National Weather Service has issued multiple red flag fire warnings throughout the state. And in particular, last year, we saw fire outbreaks in northern Michigan. And Dr. Clements, in your testimony, you focused on programs that are aimed at fire weather research and wildfire prediction. Could you tell me more about the types of climate smart investments in research that are needed for us to better understand the influences of wildfire on weather and vice versa?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. I think one focus, what I mentioned earlier, would be this coupled fire atmosphere modeling tool, because it's the only tool that actually allows the atmosphere to drive the fire and then the fire itself to drive the atmosphere. And that's where we get our most dangerous fires, is when we have big plumes and you can't predict where that fire is going to go. So investment into high resolution coupled fire atmosphere models is critical. And like I mentioned earlier, it's used in, so Greece, it's their national model. They have already adopted it. National Center for Atmospheric Research is also building on that model. So these are the kind of tools I think that we really need to invest in. In addition, it also predicts smoke at very high resolution. And so you can tell a community what the smoke concentration is going to be in an hour, tomorrow, or the next day. So that's where I would really focus a lot of investment in terms of modeling.
Well, and do you have recommendations or any examples that you know of how the federal government is working across agencies to forecast and predict these fires and better inform and protect the public?
Well, yeah. So in terms of national, we have the National Fire Danger Rating System, which allows us to understand what the fire risk is. And so that goes across the nation. That's a U.S. Forest Service product. But it needs to be a little bit more higher resolution in terms of forecasting certain areas. For fire behavior research, it's agency specific. We don't really have a fire behavior prediction system at a national level.
You're muted.
I muted myself. Okay, and then another major priority for many of us, including myself on this committee, has been the effort to strengthen our STEM pipeline to ensure that we have trained scientists and engineers who are ready to help address the 21st century challenges that are before us. And Dr. McCarthy and Dr. Clements, are there skills from the fire management side of this work that you believe would benefit the STEM workforce or relate to activities with STEM workforce training? And how would you recommend those skills to be transferred?
Sure. I'll begin with that. So I'm not from Ohio. I'm actually from Eastern Kentucky. And funnily enough, I'm married to a man from Michigan. My daughter was born in the UP. So I know a lot about Appalachian Eastern Forest Fire, interval fire, return interval fire regimes. But I started actually as an undergrad working for the Daniel Boone National Forest and learned a lot of technical skills. And as a first generation student, that was really important for me as a pipeline into graduate school at the University of Maryland to have that applied workforce working on fire risk modeling within an eastern forest because of southern pine beetle infestation. And that was one of the reasons that I was able to get a graduate assistantship from a small school in Appalachia, was because I had worked on these types of on-the-ground management, STEM skills in computing and data science. And so I didn't come from a very prestigious undergraduate institution, though it is great. And so that helped me in that pipeline. So I do think that throughout, holistically, the wildfire science community, this is a good way to get anyone from anywhere, whether they're, a woman or a man, non-binary, to get involved, because we are welcome. This is a problem, across all 50 states and solutions. So I would just say that and turn it over to Dr. Clements.
Real quick. At San Jose State, we created a new wildfire sciences minor. And so that'll allow us to bring students from a diverse background into our field to give them some tool sets that they can take to, like, if they're a business major, if they're a psychology major, they'll be aware of the wildfire problem. In addition to fire weather training that is very critical for meteorologists to have, which is something that we're also doing and is a need around the nation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and we'll turn now to Mr. Feenstra.
Thank you, Chairman Lofgren and Ranking Member Lucas, and thank you to all our witnesses for your testimony and sharing your extensive research and your experience with us. This question is for Mr. Geisler. In 2020, Iowa experienced 126 wildfire incidents that burned almost 2,200 acres. These fires can jump from burning grasslands to agricultural fields, reaping financial devastation for our farmers. What is the current state of understanding as to how a forest or grass-based wildfire interacts with spreads across agricultural land? What research questions remain to be answered in this domain?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. There is a lot of work that is actually ongoing relative to the interaction between agricultural croplands and wildland fire. For most wildland fire managers, we actually utilize a lot of agricultural croplands because at certain times they are the most irrigated spots on the planet, and we are able to use them in forest fire control. But as you know, and others on the committee know, at various stages of the crop cycle, you're going to have conditions where crops can be damaged, or that the fuels that are remaining on the ground can carry a wildfire. So basically, a lot of the types of fuels that we're seeing on the ground do fit within some of our existing models. They need to be fine-tuned somewhat as far as the local conditions, and a lot of the local agencies do some of that work in-house just to correlate the types of agricultural crops that they're currently seeing on the ground relative to the standard fuels models that we have. But there is probably some ongoing work that could happen there, and especially where it comes into crop protection going forward.
Yeah, thank you. And I've seen that a lot with our corn crop in the fall and soybeans when we're ready to harvest, and a spark, set off by a combine or whatever, and we have a lot of devastation. I have one other question for you. Iowa is also home to numerous lakes and rivers, which are important for recreation, economic activities for my constituents. When discussing wildfires, we commonly focus on the damage and destruction due to the flames and vegetation and to the man-made infrastructures. However, I'd like to ask, what consequences can high intensity and high heat wildfires have on watersheds, and what additional research do we need to better understand these impacts?
I'm actually very glad you brought that one up. Post-fire recovery is something that a lot of us within the Wildland Fire Leadership Council and within the community are really looking to how do we better do a better job of this. Right now, if you look at resources that are available, the Forest Service does have what they call burn area response units or BEAR teams that can evaluate and look to those areas to determine what are going to be the impacts, how do we recover. More specifically, a lot of that revolves around impacts to water quality as well as vegetation recovery. The resources available at the state and local level are very limited. And in fact, in most cases, a lot of that does not get done. But when you have the effects of a catastrophic wildfire or one that removes a significant portion of the vegetation, obviously that's going to have an impact on water quality downstream. And so the idea of what we need to do, how we address it is all being discussed right now. I know that the national sciences groups are actually coordinating through USGS and others with trying to come to a better way to effectively address these issues following some of these fires. And it does not matter if you're working in a mountainous terrain where a lot of people think it is more significant or more visible, I should say. But on all aspects of watersheds, if you have these kind of damaging fires, you can impact the water quality.
Yeah, I really appreciate that information. We see that in Iowa quite a bit, where all of a sudden you have, the buffer strip gets burned away, and all of a sudden you have significant erosion. And there's really not a lot to stop that until the next spring, until the grass grows back or vegetation grows back. So, it's always a concern for me. So I thank you for your responses, and I thank you to all the testimony of each one of you. And I yield my time back. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Stansbury is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you so much for holding this important hearing this morning. I also want to thank especially Chief Litzenberg for being here this morning from Santa Fe County, which is from my home state in New Mexico. Thank you for your service, and to all of our local, state, county, federal, and tribal firefighters, thank you for your work on the front lines protecting our communities. And I also want to thank you for sharing your expertise this morning. So I think it goes without saying that addressing wildfire is not only a matter of protecting our public safety and the ecological well-being of our forests and our communities, but in New Mexico, it's also a matter of national security because a significant number of our forest lands also abut on our national laboratories and our federal military installations as well. But it's also the single largest threat to water and drought resilience in New Mexico and much of the West as well as our future climate adaptation and economic security. And as was noted by Chief Litzenberg's testimony, we're already spending billions of dollars a year at the federal and local and tribal levels to both suppress fire and fight fires across the West. So one of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about today is our forest science. So we've focused a lot here today on remote sensing, fire weather, warning systems, and hazards. But one of the most significant and important ways that we can address and mitigate the catastrophic fires that are affecting the West is through forest management. And this is especially true in New Mexico, where a lot of really exciting climate and forest management science is happening. So we're seeing a lot of really incredible partnerships between our tribes and pueblos, our local county officials, nonprofit organizations like the Nature Conservancy, our national laboratories, who are doing really exciting, complex modeling around forest dynamics, carbon sequestration, soil, and ways in which we can actually target our forest treatments. And in fact, one of the things that's most exciting to me about having Chief Litzenberg here this morning is that he was intimately involved in these activities in what is called the Santa Fe Fireshed Program, which is a collaborative of all of these different programs. And so my question is actually for our chief, Mr. Litzenberg. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Santa Fe Fireshed efforts and share with us how the science was leveraged and partnerships were leveraged and how we might scale this exciting collaborative model across the West.
I sure can, Congresswoman. And again, very, very much appreciate that question because it is near and very dear to me. The Greater Santa Fe Fireshed Coalition is a very successful collaboration, and it was built from the ground up around the premise that if you bring the right people to the table, much like you have, I think, on this panel, who can put their 2 cents into the mix, you often get a product that's much better than a single person or a single organization could have come up with. And in that coalition, we have all levels of government. We have nonprofit, we have scientists, we have people from the labs, and we even have people who don't necessarily agree with what we're doing. And we had regular meetings to talk about how do we make our watershed and our forests healthier and safer and ultimately protect our communities, both for recreation, for life safety, and prevent the large fires and those things that occur. We've talked about the smoke, we've talked about the post-fire debris. They've got huge destructive potential to not only primary effects, but secondary and tertiary effects. And anything you can do to research and create data on those things that are modifiable and toss them into a room where smart minds can think together and come up with solutions, much like the Santa Fe Fireshed Coalition. I think replication of that across the West and the nation is much in order. Thanks for asking that question.
Thank you, Chief Litzenberg. And I would really encourage my colleagues. I know many in the fire community are very familiar with these efforts in New Mexico, but it's a really exciting model, and the Rio Grande watershed efforts that are being put into restoring our forests are really a model for the nation. And finally, I just want to say that there's a coupled opportunity while we're talking about fire mitigation to talk about carbon sequestration. A recent study by the Climate Alliance in New Mexico showed that reforestation of burned catastrophic fire areas has a huge potential to help capture carbon. So I really think that that's an important part of the science that we need to be introducing into the conversation. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Now the gentleman from California, Mr. Olbernotti, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and thank you to all of our panelists. I represent a very fire-prone and very rural section of the Western United States. And so the prevention of these wildfires is of critical importance to the people that I represent. And I know a lot of the people in this room share that concern. One of the things that I was struck by in the testimony from all 4 of our witnesses is the inadequacy of the current satellite data that we're getting, both in terms of geospatial resolution and in terms of temporal resolution. And frankly, I had no idea that it was still this bad, that to be talking about geospatial resolution of a kilometer and temporal resolution of only 1 or 2 frames per day is clearly not going to be adequate to generate the kind of wildfire models that we need to predict wildfire behavior, and certainly is not going to be as useful as it could be to be able to give early warning when new wildfires start. So that's what I'd like to ask some questions about. And I probably could pick any of the panelists, but Dr. McCarty, I was struck by your testimony about this. Can you talk a little bit about what the prospects are for improved satellite imaging, if we have anything in the pipeline, and in particular, maybe talk about the fact that I know that we're talking about we're talking about geostationary satellites mostly here, but the state of the art in satellites now is low Earth orbit satellites, which might solve your spatial resolution problems also. Is there some prospect that we could use some of the assets that we have to solve this problem?
Yes, and thank you, Congressman, for that question. I do think that we have a lot of work going on at NASA, at NOAA. I know NIST even had a small workshop around this a few years ago of data fusion, of thinking about how to incorporate various polar orbiting satellites, including low Earth orbit, and some of our commercial platforms, as well as our open source geostationary, to provide better temporal resolution. It's more complicated with spatial resolution because you just kind of have to accept the data as it is, how it was engineered. If it was engineered at 10 kilometers, it's 10 kilometers. And you just have to take that location and then try to compare it to something that's 10 meters in resolution. We've also had in the last 10 years, and much credit to NASA, USGS, and NOAA for their collaboration with the European Space Agency, with the Indian Space Agency, with the Japanese Space Agency, and trying to improve some of our other collaborations so that we have open source access to their platforms and are developing, kind of a cross-pollination coordination. And to be fair, sometimes our satellite systems are developed because they are meeting the needs of the community and not just the fire community. Often they need to meet agriculture and food security. They need to meet biodiversity and forest management. They need to think about water quality, as well as the atmospheres and the lithosphere as well. And so sometimes what we need for fire will get maybe pushed to the end, or at least the resolution will be downgraded a bit, because there are these other components that also need to be captured in the same platform. And so I do think that NOAA's GeoXO, which is in collaboration with NASA, is one way to move forward. They did hold a workshop last summer with local, state, and federal level fire researchers and practitioners and management to get their input on that. But even that system, which was an RFP was issued and two contractors were selected earlier this spring, its highest resolution will be 0.5 kilometer. And so really we need to think about setting an agenda where we want spatial resolution that is helpful both tactically and strategically for fire management. And if I will return to you if you have further questions.
Well, thank you. I completely agree. I'm horrified that we don't have access to higher resolution data than that. And as a scientist myself, I can tell you, there's no way you can create meaningful prediction models based on that. And as you say, it would be very. We've got all of these high-speed aerial assets now for fighting the fires. It'd be very helpful to be able to have real-time information about when the fires start and where. So I'm hopeful that we in Congress can help you to solve this problem and get access to this higher resolution data, because then we can, as you say, take the next step, work with the National Science Foundation, and catalyze some more research into this topic. But I see my time's expired. I want to thank you to all of our panelists, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Foster is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Clements, in your testimony, you stated your team has deployed to nearly 40 wildfires in California with specialized equipment, including mobile Doppler, LiDAR, and radar assets, and that these tools have provided a lot of insights into the dynamic of plume-dominated wildfires and how the fires in the atmosphere interact with each other on a large scale. Back in my district in Illinois, last week we had some tornadoes, and it was amazing when you looked at the data that was available in real time from LiDAR system and Doppler radar. That my wife and I basically, got into a safe area, turned on the TV, and we could watch the tornado vortex as it moved across neighborhoods just south of my house. And so I was wondering, I'm very interested in the technological developments in sensors, and particularly cost reduction, that would really help us have a much higher density of sensors on there. And so in regards to that, roughly the equipment that you deploy, how much does it cost if you just had to buy another one of those?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. So the radar is a special radar. It's a Ka band. It's custom made. It's not that expensive. It's about $700,000,
okay,
not including the truck and all that stuff. And that's probably a relatively low cost, high resolution Doppler radar. The LiDARs are even less expensive. They're about $350,000. And so, these aren't super expensive instruments, but to set up a network of those, it would be somewhat costly. Now, the advantage of also the LiDAR is it allows us to look at vertical wind profiles, which is really critical in downslope windstorms and understanding the onset of critical winds for fire weather, particularly in California with the public safety power shutoffs. And so there's a need for those. Just to get back to the surface weather station discussion, California has more surface weather stations than any other place on the planet because of the utilities. They've invested a lot into meteorological data for their modeling. And so I think we can get the costs down if we build more instruments, or we can use new engineering technologies to build these instruments better and cheaper. So there is a way to use it. In addition, we also have the National Radar Network, for the NOAA Radar Network, that we use for wildfire observations as well. So there's a lot of things that we can do.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to get better at as a nation is making high-tech stuff cheaper in large quantity. And I think you might be able to bootstrap this if there was just an agreement that we're going to deploy, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of equipment like you deploy all over the country. And you might find the cost curve goes down pretty sharply. Is there a consensus on the types of data points and the collection assets that you'd like? You mentioned ground-based stations. You can imagine drone swarms that come in over fires, maybe just more investment in satellites, or maybe more investment in just the inventories of all the consumables that are on the ground. Is there an agreement on what you'd really like, or is that still something that's under discussion?
Well, I think in terms of the fire weather community, we're probably in agreement that we need more atmospheric observations, but then we also need to understand what the fire is doing at every instant. One technology that's coming out is small radars that are cheaper, that you can put on power poles or utility assets. So that way you can scan everything versus just the national radar network. So using smaller radars that are getting more cost effective could be a really good asset in the future.
All right. And could someone say a little bit about the collaboration, the state of collaboration, particularly with DoD? I don't think I'm giving away any national security secrets to say that we spend a lot of time looking for infrared flares for various purposes. And so I was wondering, do you hit a roadblock where you say, well, we could give you information, but then we don't want the bad guys to know we have this capability, so we won't tell you? Or is there really a pretty good collaboration in real time when there's a serious fire hazard?
Well, I guess I could take that for my knowledge. What I know is that there's a FireGuard product that maps the fire in real time for fire agencies. Those data are not publicly available, but the technology is there. So, increasing that collaboration could be very useful, or using that technology in a more public framework would be beneficial to the research community.
Okay, that sounds like it could be a job for Congress. The other possible collaboration might be insurance companies. Did they look at detailed fire modeling to come up with their insurance rates on a house-by-house level? Are they big players in this?
Yeah, we're working with some insurance companies now, as well as the utilities. I mean, there's so much investment needed in a better understanding of the fire problem. And so insurance companies are definitely interested in the risk, for sure.
Okay, thank you. My time is up and yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Webster is recognized.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for holding this meeting. Chief Litzenberg, I had a question about, you mentioned some items or fields of future focus in your report, and kind of things like remote sensing or fire mapping, things like that. Which of those would be the highest priority?
Congressman, thanks for that question. It is a tough one for me to answer because, in my view, all of these are somewhat related. And so, if you were asking for a priority, it is a difficult one. I can say that the creation of a sensing network, I'll go back to the discussion I had a few minutes ago about Santa Fe Fireship Coalition. Part of the success of that is a lot of viewpoints. And to me, you get a better view when you're getting a lot of viewpoints, whether it's social science or whether it's technology and data. So the more we can create a sensor network that is both ground-based and up to the satellites, that integrates and gives us real-time forecasting and mapping, that to me is a huge priority. But that actually falls into some of the other priorities, like putting that data in a single usable place where all levels of government are sharing data significantly, using that data to create situational awareness in real time for boots on the ground, and ultimately a network of communication that links all of these priorities together. Again, in summary, it's hard for me to prioritize because they work together, but that's probably how I would do so since you asked me to do so.
Thank you for that. Last week we had the new NASA administrator, Senator Nelson, and he was here. We were talking about collaboration and how much is there and how it's working and so forth. He was pretty confident that there was a lot of collaboration from at least NASA in the areas of hurricane tracking and firefighting, floods, so forth. My question would be this whole idea of remote sensing. Should there be, or are there already ways where that information is being coordinated and communicated to local and state foresters in communities to improve prevention of, and also maybe mitigation in the area of forest fires? Do you know anything about that?
Congressman, I can give you my opinion from being somebody at the local level. I've always had the impression that that data exists and that it should be reachable. And in places where there are good relationships, it often is, but it is really dependent on the caliber of those relationships. There are places nationally, we've referenced Wildland Fire Leadership Council, we've referenced National Interagency Fire Center, where integration is happening, and I think it's happening well and thoroughly. But it's not always getting down to the community level where decisions about prevention and mitigation can be made appropriately, and that's potentially a huge place for future improvements.
Well, that's something we're going to have to work on. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Sherman of California is recognized.
Thank you. I want to thank the committee for having this hearing. I take it personally, having been evacuated from my home just a couple of years ago with the Saddle Ridge fire, representing a district that goes right up against the city limits of Los Angeles. Mr. Geisler, in your written testimony, you note that the buildup of hazardous fuels on many of our publicly managed lands are at historic levels. And you further note that past management activities have actually made our public lands even more vulnerable. How can research improve the maintenance issues so as to reduce the likelihood of fires like those we've seen in California?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. And, as you said, our forests and landscapes are really at a point where their resiliency is questionable in many places. Science and research has really been doing a lot of work relative to how we best turn the corner on these landscapes. There's always ongoing research related to fuels and what is on the ground. There's a lot of work within FIA, the Forest Inventory and Analysis world, where essentially we are learning more and more about what the conditions are, what the state of our forest is, so that we can better address the issue that's there. And I will say the Forest Inventory and Analysis program through the Forest Service is one of those things that is kind of an unsung hero, providing us with a lot of longstanding data and information related to how our forests and landscapes have changed over time. So it's there. It's ongoing below the surface, and it does not get a lot of notice from those of us that are outside of the community, but making sure that we have effective funding for forest inventory and analysis, and then programs like the Joint Fire Sciences Program that helps coordinate the research utilized in some of that data is really some of the critical needs.
Thank you. Firefighters, emergency officials, Dr. Clements, you indicated how they and community leaders can struggle with disaster management. Wildfire season is increasingly becoming year-round. Our firefighters are being asked to work impossible hours in hazardous conditions. Dr. Clements, how can we better use scientific modeling and the enormous amount of data that have been collected to better predict the number of firefighting personnel that we will need?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. So that's a difficult question. So what we could do in the future is using some of these state-of-the-art fire prediction models to look at what what we should expect. How big are these fires going to be, given changes in wind, changes in temperature, and fuels? And so that could give us an idea of what resources and suppression needs are going to be required in the future. So that's one way to use some of these new models that are very high resolution to look at what those needs could be in the future.
Thank you. And I also want to take a minute to thank the Appropriations Subcommittee for funding a project, or recommending the funding of a project in my district to replace invasive and highly flammable shrubs with native and fire-resistant shrubs right there in the area of the Cessnon and Saddle Ridge fires that we've suffered through in recent years. I thank you for your comments, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Dr. Baird is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Lucas for holding this hearing. I always learn something in this committee, and so I really appreciate the professionalism and the expertise of our witnesses, and I thank them for being here today. I'm going to continue on a little bit with the conversation my colleague, Mr. Webster, was having. And so my questions are going to be to the Chief Litzenberg as well as to Mr. Geisler. But Chief, you mentioned in your testimony, you highlighted that the collaboration among local fire departments with federal research and working with NSF, NIST, or NIST, and NASA needs to further grow to improve the nation's wildfire response. And then you followed that with 8 fields of future focus on this matter, such as remote sensing, fire mapping, and others. And so in that context, then I want to extend my question to be, how can we use these tools that you mentioned there to really increase the active force management and the implementation of fuel treatments? Because I think those have a real impact on being able to prevent many of these wildfires. And so with that, Chief, if you would care to comment, I would appreciate that.
Thanks for the question, Congressman. And yeah, I'll give you my perspective again as a local responder. And I think my perspective is probably shared by many responders and fire chiefs. I said it a few minutes ago, and I'll say it again. I do believe that there is a lot of data that's being created and a lot of very smart people, many of whom are here today, who are doing great things around fire science. And often the missing link is, how do I, as a community responder, how do I, as a fire chief, get that data in a place that's usable and then use it to do prevention and mitigation primarily. I often look at communities, and we have the term fire adapted communities now, but I often look at communities as an organism, much like a human. And if you look at your body over the years, you've counted on somebody to get data about you, whether it's doing brain scans when you got a headache, whether it's looking at your heart when you have chest pain, evaluating your blood, and you get data points. And then you have somebody who looks at those data points and gives you a recommendation on what do you do about that? And what do you do in terms of prevention to make sure that the ultimate effect is not catastrophic on your body? Communities and ecosystems are no different. And we're creating data points. And in my opinion, what we really need is a place where that data is collected in one single place, where everybody is dumping everything that they're learning into a single place. And then there's somebody or a committee or a group or an organization, much like a doctor, who's telling me as a local community, what do I do with that data? How can I make my forest healthier? How can I make my community safer? And ultimately, how can I provide for public safety to those who want to live safely within the urban interface?
Thank you. Mr. Geisler, would you care to add to that?
Yes, and Chief Litzenberg really hit the nail on the head. It's the availability and the utilization of all of this data that is being created, and making sure that we have the ability to share it across the various jurisdictions. And it has happened in some places. I can give you an example of within my own state where we utilize data from federal, state, and local, who we have come together and are sharing it across jurisdictional boundaries to develop a forest health strategy for our state, prioritizing all of the landscapes across all jurisdictions. And that is in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, state agencies, and locals. And it ties back to our forest health management. And then we also have used it on our wildfire strategy that we're building out. But it takes a lot of interagency discussions, and it takes an environment where there's a shared mission on how we need to address or what the end goal should be. And that, again, much like Eric said, is a lot of folks are organizations are essentially working on their own and discovering things. And that leads to sometimes reinventing wheels. And to the point of getting it all to one location, getting the information on how this can be used, collected, analyzed, and then sent out and communicated is just absolutely critical.
Thank you very much. And I'm out of time, so I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Byer is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. This is fascinating stuff, and I'd like to start with Dr. McCarty, because the NASA's the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee of this committee held a few weeks ago on NASA's climate science work, and we heard an awful lot about the growing commercial remote sensing industry's ability to support NASA's Earth science activities, but primarily through data buys. But the hearing also identified questions about commercial data transparency, accessibility, license restrictions that could have implications for free and open access to federally funded Earth science data. So what are your perspectives on the opportunities and challenges of commercial remote sensing data sets and wildfire research?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I mean, commercial data is proprietary. And so when we, and I, full disclosure, have been a NASA-funded PI who has access to those commercial data buys, but they must be in the regions in which the project that I have competitively, applied for has been selected. And so if for instance, for Fire XAQ, which was a partnership between NOAA and NASA, I was on the NASA side. I was able to look at commercial data sets, and still I'm able to look at commercial data sets for regions and fires that we flew the DC-8 through the smoke plumes. But if I wanted to expand that to other states where we didn't fly, that would not necessarily be permitted. I would need to go back and request and ask why. I would also say that the commercial data is of high quality. It's definitely an add-on. It's one of those data fusion products we want to include. It requires a high level of computing and data science and coding skills to implement. Our NASA and NOAA Earth observation products are often some of the best in the world. They're plug and play in a lot of ways. And our commercial data sets are not quite there, but that's not necessarily their business model. So they haven't been given the right incentive, stick or carrot, to develop those products. They would be something that would fill in that gap if we want multiple daily imagery. But to really get at some of the fire weather, you need kind of like a weather system, a geostationary system where you're getting something every 15 minutes, half hour.
All the time. But let me ask a larger, more existential question. It seems that fire science has changed an awful lot since I was a kid. Smokey the Bear, I was impressed that we heard the 78% or 84% are still human caused. But back then, no fires. And then later on, I served for a number of years on that House Natural Resources Committee, where some of my friends were like, we need to do much more forestry. Because we have to clear out all the trees and that way they won't burn down. And then you had our most recent president talking about raking the forests in Norway. Where exactly and I know climate change has complicated all of this immensely. I know you have projects with prescribed fires, but is there a larger scientific sense of how best to manage forests with respect to fires?
We have, I would say, a coalescing convergence there's always more. Science is frustratingly like that. There's always more to know. However, what we have learned are, North America is a fire adapted ecosystem. Many of our natural areas are adapted to burn. And so to function, they must burn. The fire will come. Stephen Pine, the fire historian, has shown time and time again. Prescribed burning is one of those forest management techniques. Like you were saying, there were no fires, right? Well, that's because there was active fire suppression. We're now in a fire deficit where we have many of our wildland areas that aren't having enough fires. And so we need more prescribed burning. And that's when we talk about indigenous burning, prescribed burning. And we have some systems that burn too much close to our WUI, close to our agricultural systems. But some of our rangeland systems need to be burned more. And so it becomes this very complex, what I like to call a patchwork quilt of what the ecosystem really looks like. And so management and science has to really view that complexity. And that includes our fuel systems, not just thinking of it as all grasses, having buildings, and so on and so forth. Back to you.
Madam Chair, with the Chief Litzenberg, do you have anything to add in the last 20 seconds?
I think that was a solid answer, and I agree entirely. Nothing significant to add.
Great. I look forward to the science continuing to evolve. Thank you very much. So, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. And the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This will be for Mr. Clements to start with. The state with the most fires, is that data readily available?
Yeah, those data are nationally compiled. And so it can be easily accessed generally.
Did I understand in your exchange with Bill Foster that I thought you said the data wasn't given? What data was that? Do you remember that exchange?
No, I don't think that was me.
Okay. And then I'll go to Mr. Geisler. Do we have, you had a discussion with Daniel Webster. Do we have enough interagency interaction? And is there somebody that tracks that and how successful that's been?
We have exceptional interagency cooperation at both the national, regional, and state levels. We have a lot of discussions among the state foresters, the emergency managers, on how we can improve it, along with our federal partners at FEMA and the USDA Forest Service and DOI and others. The collaboration revolves around the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, as well as the Wildland Fire Leadership Council. And we really try to go through what is an ongoing continuous improvement kind of cycle with relation to that. All of the agreements that are in place, in fact, whether it be a master agreement between federal agencies and states, or numerous state to state or state to local agreements, all usually have some form of an assessment piece that's involved in it, whereby we take a look at how it's working and try to improve on that.
Has there been a discussion about whether or not if you widen the rights of ways in some of these heavily forested areas, that would reduce some of the wildfires?
Those typically are occurring at the local and state level as we do our wildfire prevention planning. There's a lot of work that even within your home state of Texas with the community wildfire preparedness planning, whereby you take and look at a community and determine what would be the best way to mitigate the risk to that community, as well as mitigate the risk to the natural resources around it. And those are all part of kind of a process that's utilized that we try to get done, obviously, before the fire gets accomplished. Texas, in fact, has an excellent program that they're utilizing in order to have those discussions. And to your point, I mean, a lot of it occurs all across the United States, across all levels of government and within the local communities and even private citizens. A lot of it involves just giving a framework of how to get it done. And that's where a lot of funding and research could be utilized just on the social sciences side of how we get this information better understood and accepted by our public, as well as funding on facilitation and process in order to get these things done. If there's a place where we we say we need to really accelerate on a curve, that is one place that you could point to.
What state would you say has the most wildfires?
I think the last time we checked, it was, if you look at sheer numbers, it was California. But to the point of Dr. Clemens, all of that information is readily available through the National Interagency Fire Center as we all report our fires up through the systems that are involved.
Follow-up question to that is, would most of those fires have been caused by utility companies? I think one of the questions I had, we talked about insurance. Some of the testimony earlier about insurance companies were extremely interested. Energy companies or power companies were extremely interested. Would you agree that those, well, not the insurance companies, but maybe the utility companies, lines sparking together in high wind areas, for example, is that probably the major cause of, let's, for example, say California's fires?
Actually, the major cause is humans. We do sometimes very foolish things, whether it be dragging a chain, towing a trailer, or letting campfires. The Smokey Bear message that we talked about earlier still applies in many cases. And the causes that you're talking about, they do occur. I'm not going to deny that we don't have equipment sparking with utilities, but we are working with the utilities trying to best figure out ways to minimize that risk that's out there. But if you ask for the purely what is the biggest cause, it's you and I, essentially, when you look at the cost data.
So are you saying this world would be a really good place if it wasn't for the humans?
Well, we interact with our environment and change it all the time. And I think us being better aware of what we can do to prevent that would be a much better place. Sometimes we don't think about what we're doing, and it takes just some simple awareness to really make us take that extra step. Most people don't realize that they can cause a spark mowing their lawn and set a fire that easily until it happens to them. And we really do want them to understand, or want everybody to understand, the risk that you're taking and how you can help us.
Al, I thank you for that. I appreciate your indulgence, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Jerry McNerney is recognized.
Well, thank the chair. I want to thank the witnesses. This is really important to me, to my district, to people in the western part of the country. I won't be able to be as entertaining as Mr. Weber in my questions, but I'll proceed anyway. Dr. Clemens, thank you again. In your testimony, you mentioned that we need more coupling of ecological conditions, atmospheric conditions, and general fire behavior for models to more accurately identify climate change's impact on modern wildfire dynamics. Can you elaborate a bit more on how federal science agencies can be helpful in promoting this type of research?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. Yeah, so a lot of this, these coupled fire atmosphere models they're becoming operational, but they're not national, and they are very high computing. They take a lot of high computing resources. You need supercomputing centers to run these models. It's not that they can't be done, but you just need the resources. So funding centers to do that, or funding teams to run those models operationally for regions, would be probably the best way to invest into getting those models operational.
Thank you. Chief Litzenberg, the federal science agencies have limited or no role in the federal agencies that coordinate federal fire response. How would you recommend federal science agencies be better incorporated into federal wildfire response efforts?
Congressman, thanks for that question. I believe that the best way to be integrated is to use existing mechanisms, because there are mechanisms that are used successfully. Perhaps they could be improved in this avenue, but they're already there. The Joint Fire Science Program is one that's taking good science, putting it in a place that's usable to practitioners. The Wildland Fire Leadership Council and the National Interagency Fire Center are also places where integration is already occurring, and all we really need to do is put a focus on new and existing research and how it can be used and applied towards emerging issues.
Thank you. Dr. Clemens, again, in your testimony, you talk about both the importance and difficulty of collecting routine meteorological data on wildfire incidents. Do you think there's a role for federal science agencies to play in collecting more of this data?
Yes, I do. I think that we could, like I mentioned before, instrument aircraft. We could deploy more resources. Right now, the National Weather Service Incident Meteorologist Program, which is like over 50 meteorologists that go to active wildfires and other disasters around the country, they deploy and they can request surface weather stations, but it takes a while to get those stations in place because they have to be driven out from a location and set up in the field. And so we could potentially have other types of technology, wind profilers, Doppler radar networks that are higher resolution that could be either deployed rapidly, like in a storm chasing manner, or through teams that are already established with the incident command team or the fire incident. So yeah, I think the federal government could actually play a big role. It's just like hurricane hunters. We have those aircraft that go sample those hurricanes to collect the meteorological data, but we don't have that for wildfire. And it's the same type of information that we need to better model and predict what the fire is going to do and how the atmosphere is playing a role on that fire spread.
And data standardization would be helpful too, I imagine.
Yeah, we have to have standards in the data as well, particularly some of the remote sensing data, because a lot of these images that you can get from like private vendors is saturated. And so that means that it's like, you're not getting the accurate temperature. You're not really seeing what the fire's doing. You're seeing kind of a blob on an image. So having better data standards would be improvement for what we have currently.
Well, as co-chair of the House Artificial Intelligence Caucus with my colleague, Mr. Gonzalez, one of the areas I'm interested in is how AI can be used in wildfire response. Chief Litzenberg, can you respond to that?
You know, I can do my best to respond to that as the non-scientist, more of the practitioner side. Anything that we can use to take existing information and create it in a usable fashion for those of us who are actually doing the boots on the ground practitioner work, to me is a bonus. And if that includes the use of AI, then I say we're in. That's something that should be explored into the future.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to yield back then.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Gonzalez is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our panel for being with us today and sharing your perspectives. Mr. Geisler, I want to start with you, and I want to talk about tree spatial patterning. So I'd like to get your thoughts on this. New research indicates that trees in spatial patterns are more fire resistant than those uniformly or evenly spaced. Should we be encouraging more managers to adopt spatial reforestation, or is more research and testing of this method required?
Thank you for the question. I'm not as familiar with the latest research in this that has come out. I can tell you only from a fire manager's perspective that obviously changing the spatial relationship among stems or trees in a forest obviously changes fire behavior characteristics. But then along the same lines, I do know that in our southern states where we do a lot of intensive silviculture related to like plantation forestry, those actually have created issues in the past because of the nature of the change in fuel spread. So I would have to do a little bit more research to give you a solid answer on that. And I'm willing to follow up with you on it.
Great. Thank you. And my next question was, how can federal science agencies assist in these efforts? So I guess I'd turn it back to you. Maybe it's just we need more research on it, but I'll let you answer.
Well, you know, and again, as this type of research comes out, the modification of fuel profiles in general, whether it be through spatial changes between trees or the removal of ladder fuels and percentages related to that, all of that stuff are items that foresters and natural resource managers are looking at all the time, not just from the standpoint of fire management, but also from the standpoint of just pure forest health and resiliency to other things like insects and disease. So, you know, obviously increasing and improving the research availability is always important, as well as I'm going to kind of always tie back to the making of that research and information available to the practitioners on the ground. And sometimes that it requires more of a social scientist to come up with how to get that best across. But I agree that more work is needed.
Thanks. And then a somewhat related question, perhaps. Obviously, the United States is the only country that's dealing with wildfires. There's been high-profile issues with wildfires across the globe in various ways. What learnings, if any, can we take from how this is managed in other parts of the world that we should be applying to how we deal with wildfires in the U.S.?
There's actually a continuous sharing along those lines also. Even within my own state, we partner with our fellow firefighters in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and others on the Canadian side as we share resources across the border all the time. And there's obviously a discussion of the tools that we use, be it everything from how we manage our firefighter safety to the tactics that we're utilizing. You've obviously or should have heard of where we bring firefighters in from other countries, and even the Forest Service has gone to other countries like Australia. And through all of those, we have a sharing environment. That is one of the foundational elements within the wildland firefighting community, is to maintain that learning environment as we go and use different tools and techniques. And there's the Wildfire Lessons Learned Center and others that actually helps to disseminate this information. So the experience of, again, getting the right people in the room with a shared experience that I believe Eric spoke to earlier. You get a lot of people in the room talking about the same thing, and you can come up with some fairly amazing ideas. And we have made changes to our systems and tweaked our processes in order to get better, just because of the experiences that we've had with our fellow firefighters from other countries.
Great. Thank you. That's very, very helpful. I appreciate your testimony and responses, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Caston is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Dr. Clement, I'd like to start with you. And one of the things that's always sort of struck me as the hardest thing to deal with on climate change sociologically is that there's all these nonlinearities, and we just do a bad job of anticipating accelerating trends. Obviously, that contributes to the increasing numbers and severity of wildfires that we've seen. But if you look just at wildfire science, as you try to predict what's going to happen over the next 5-10 years, are there major nonlinearities that are either feedback loops making it worse or that might damp it with respect to wildfire science that we should be thinking of, on the expectation that we're probably not anticipating those things very well either?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Congressman. Yeah, so in terms of climate change and feedback loops, as we change, as the environment gets warmer, we're going to change the fuel structures. We're going to change our landscape, so that can impact, maybe for the better at times, different types of fuel structures. So we could convert some, after fire, we can convert some forest to maybe grasslands, and that could lessen extreme fire, but it could make it more ignitable as well. So there are feedbacks. It's not really my expertise, so I could look into that a little bit more and get back to you. But I think one thing that we need to consider in terms of climate change is that these trends, the predictions are, we have to continue look at attribution, what's really causing all these things. We know it's climate change, we know it's forest management, we know it's climate-induced drought and weather. So, but we can still put more science into fine-tuning what those attributions are in terms of what's going to happen in the future. We could use high-resolution modeling in a different state, so we can use 2050 climate scenarios and model what fires are going to look like then. That's something that we're planning on doing. So that could be one way to kind of diagnose the changes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I got to get two more questions. Dr. McCarty, you had mentioned in your comments about, we're seeing wildfires in places like the Smoky Mountains that we haven't thought about before. With these trends, are there areas or types of fires that you think are going to be more likely in the future that we need to be thinking about and preparing for?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Congressman. In fact, the Eastern Forest used to be called the asbestos forest by many professional foresters because they said that they wouldn't burn, but that is in fact not actually that was not true. It's just they have a longer fire return interval. And so we will expect, as the Southeast becomes hotter and drier, particularly in our upland areas, that fire risk will increase. And this is a WUI question, a wildland urban interface question. We've had a lot of people move in to places like Asheville, Knoxville, Tennessee, even parts of West Virginia and, in Pennsylvania. So we're going to see more fire risk. The other thing is to think about, NIFC reported that in 2019, just in terms of burned area, total acres burned, the state with the most wildfire is Alaska. Mm-hmm. And so Alaska is a state we need to have on our minds as wildland fire scientists, because in the future, we will see more Arctic fires, we will see more boreal fires. Those fire regimes are accelerating. And in fact, we will see more of our organic carbon soils burn and then burn through the winter and reignite in the spring. And that's just a continuation of fire seasons. And that is a different type of fire management. And I do think the Alaskan Forest Service and the Alaskan Fire Consortium is a very professional and outstanding group. And they are trying through research and science to figure out how to work these new challenges in the future. Wow. Thank you.
So last question with the little time I've got left is really for any of you who feel comfortable answering this, and it's a little beyond this committee. Lael Brainerd, who's on the Fed Board of Governors in January, said the scientific evidence for climate change is unequivocal, but the magnitude of climate-related financial risks are highly uncertain. And among those are wildfires. And she noted that more than 70% of the losses from natural disasters are uninsured, and warned of the potential to create abrupt repricing events. I spend a lot of time on the Financial Services Committee thinking about how our financial system is at stress from this. And of course, we've had some conversations about, if you were an investor in PG&E, you may feel that directly from the wildfire damage. As you think about where there are big exposures to private capital from wildfires, any major concerns? And I realize this is more of a financial question than a scientific question, but you can't separate the two. They're all linked. Anybody want to comment on that?
I will just say that maybe perhaps the thing we should think about is that a lot of Americans, their capital, much of their money is wrapped up in home ownership and property ownership. And in many of our Western states, and of course, in our Eastern states and Midwestern states, as they become more fire prone, then suddenly the likelihood that you lose your home or it becomes uninsurable increases. And that is just a huge loss to private capital. And you can only imagine what that would do to our economy and our GDP and just health of our population. And so that is something that's hard to predict and hard to imagine into the future, but is a direct financial loss.
Thank you. I'm out of time and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kildee is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate you recognizing me, and I do appreciate the chair holding this important hearing. And thanks to the witnesses for your testimony. I come from Michigan. In fact, the northern part of my district is home to the Huron Forest, which is 737 plus acres over 70 miles. It's named after a Native American tribe that's local to our region. And the forest landscape is highly prone to seasonal fires. It's dominated by jack pines. Jack pine needles are highly flammable. Those seasonal fires are actually part of the life cycle of the forest. Pine cones from those jack pines containing seeds only open as a result of a fire. And the Kirtland warbler, which is a great little songbird, only breeds in those young jack pines. So as a result of logging in the forest, the warbler's habitat was at one point nearly completely destroyed. That little bird was almost completely extinct. 50 years later, due to prescribed burns and the protections put in place by the Endangered Species Act, the Kirtland warbler was successfully removed from the endangered species list. And now, each year, literally thousands of tourists come to that part of rural Michigan to see the Kirtland warbler. And so it's not just a little bird, it's a really important part of what makes that place so great, so interesting, and so attractive to people who come from all over the country just to see that rare bird. So in the forest, we have to have these prescribed burns to maintain and control wildfires. But this year, as part of a prescribed burn, an uncontrolled forest fire broke out and burned about 5,000 acres of that forest land. Climate change has contributed to these fires. Due to climate change, the forests are drier, the air is less humid, winds are stronger and more sustained, and it makes it harder to control these controlled burns, these prescribed burns. So thankfully, no people or structures were damaged, but this is the kind of threat that we face. So I'm just curious, and I guess I would ask the panelists, perhaps Mr. Geisler and Chief Litzenberg, for this Huron forest that I represent, or other forests across the country that do use prescribed burns to maintain forest health, as climate change increases the intensity of weather, what do we need to be doing? What do you suggest we do so that we can maintain control of these sorts of fires and ensure that we avoid a controlled burn, prescribed burn like this, getting out of control like the one we saw in the Huron forest? So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mr. Geisler, you want to start, and then maybe the chief could comment?
Sure. Thank you. And actually what I was going to let you know is that, the idea of like the Jack Pines situation, a lot of that revolves around the potential need for stand replacement fires, even to truly manage that landscape, which we don't do because of the risk when you have prescribed burns. And that's why a lot of what you're seeing in the type of work that's being done is on a more cyclical basis and maintaining the trees at different stages. The one piece that I wanted to make sure that everyone understood is that when a prescribed burn is planned, a plan is actually developed. And what it does is it not only is the objectives of how the burn will be occurring and what the end result needs to be, but it's usually very specific on humidity, wind direction, wind speed, and others. I think that a lot of it, like you said, is making sure we do good planning and that we follow the plan exactly. And then if there are issues, even if they're minor, learn from those. In addition to that, a lot of the research that we've talked about throughout this hearing helps to feed those plans and the knowledge that we have to develop them. So again, I wanted to just kind of bring up how a prescribed burn can be done and just the need for additional research and information to feed those.
Thank you. Chief, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I'll say it briefly. So what you just described is the social phenomenon we call fire adaptation. And it does have an effect in our ecologies as well. Back in hundreds of years ago, we decided we got to suppress everything. And all of a sudden, we had a bigger issue than we had in the past. And now we're realizing you have to control these fuels, you have to control risks, and it's healthier for forests. The more we can get information about the fuels and the more we can get information about weather to use for our planning, the better our planning will be. And I'll just say one last thing, which is, luckily, our organizations have evolved as well. And the science that our organizations and the tactics that our organizations are using to manage these forests are also getting better. So continuing to invest in those organizations and our workforces can't be overstated.
I thank you very much. And Madam Chair, I thank you for the extra time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Wild is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. And thank you for this very interesting and informative hearing. The recent extreme heat in the Pacific Northwest is obviously concerning for many reasons, not the least of which is the safety and health of the communities. But it's deeply troubling that we are seeing such a mix of limited water, dry lands, and unusually high temperatures this early in the summer. I know I'm not saying anything that you don't already know. The terrible fires we saw last summer across Western states and the lingering environmental and economic devastation highlight the importance of our scientific enterprise in informing us of climate risk and climate-related disasters. The U.S. has a number of Earth-observing satellite-based platforms that provide useful data for wildland fire science, but we also rely on assets from European and other international partners. Dr. McCarty, I'm interested to know to what extent are relevant European and international partner data coordinated with United States data, and how can we further utilize available international data?
Well, thank you for that question. I will say, as I'm not at NASA headquarters, some of this I can't speak to. I will try to reply back in writing. There are high-level interactions between NASA HQ and, of course, ESA and other international space agencies. Our researchers on the ground, including places like the U.S. Forest Geospatial Technology and Application Center in Salt Lake City, try to utilize Sentinel products. So Sentinel-2, which is kind of Landsat-like, but higher spatial resolution and higher temporal resolution. It's overhead every 3 to 5 days, depending on clouds. And some of our synthetic aperture radar data, which is at a 10-meter resolution from ESA, are now being implemented to try to look at both fire monitoring and fire detection, but also better mapping fuels conditions, including things like where peatlands are, soil moisture, and fuel moisture condition. And so in the research community, these products are being developed and are being put forward to some of our federal level operational centers. And of course, the more that we can do that in our data fusion process, the better the data is for our agencies and for our firefighters on the ground.
Okay, thank you. And Chief Litzenberg, can you go into some more detail about the proposal to develop a standard warning fire scale similar to the Richter scale for earthquakes? I'm particularly interested in how it would be beneficial for firefighters, but of course the public as well.
I sure can, Congresswoman. Thanks for the question. So much like the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale, we could develop a scale for forecasting the threat of a wildland fire. This type of warning system would require coordination between NOAA, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Department of Interior, and state, tribal, territorial, and local officials, pretty much everybody across the board. It would provide a standardized warning system to let communities and responders know what type of resources might be required to respond to a fire and what action should be taken, such as sheltering in place or evacuating. A lot of the catastrophic issues we've seen during fires are in the movement of people. And obviously that is, for all of us, the number one value. And the more we can communicate with people what to expect, the better our response system will be.
Thank you so much. I think there's great promise there. And Dr. McCarty, did you want to comment on that at all? If not, I'll yield my time.
Yes, I think that this is a great idea. In fact, if you compare some of our fire warning systems to some of our international colleagues, often our fire warning system is seen as hard to interpret because it kind of looks like a rainbow speedometer, essentially. And we would need that. And there's a lot of social science and public health research, including built environment research that could be done that will help implement such a warning system so it does communicate the right thing to people on the ground, so that is not causing problems for our wildland firefighters.
Thank you very much. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Perlmutter is recognized.
As the last questioner. So I want to follow up on Ms. Wild's questions. To Dr. McCarty and Chief Litzenberg, we were talking about satellites and coordinating with the Europeans and others, obviously the Canadians. What steps have been taken? You said that NOAA is a number of years away from really having satellites to monitor these fires. But can we monitor them with some of our military assets, our intelligence assets? And I'm saying we sometimes in Colorado, obviously, we had big fires last year and we had to call in the National Guard to assist our firefighters. Can we call in some of our space assets? Have you, either of you, heard about that?
Yes, I mean, the project I know about is FireGuard. I'd actually like to defer to Dr. Clements because he has worked with the data. I have not needed to work with that in my lab. And so I know about it. Dr. Clements, would you like to comment on that?
Well, thank you. I haven't actually been able to work with the data because it's not available for the research community. I've seen examples of it. And so that's really all I know. And when we do deploy to wildfires, we know it's there. We know that the FBANs or fire behavior analysts are getting access to that, at least on some of these big incidents. So it's available, but I have not been able to really work with those data.
Chief Litzenberg, have you had any experience using some of our other assets besides that we might have available through the military or the intelligence community?
Congressman, I have not personally had a lot of experience with that, but I'll add to what Dr. Clements just said. A lot of what is available when it is available is when large incident management teams are in place. And unfortunately, the vast majority of incidents across the nation, a large incident management team is not put into place. It's managed by local responders, whether they're from local government or from the state or from the Forest Service. So the more that we can get that information that's usable to all, the better we will be. I have not personally had that experience.
Okay. Let me ask this question. So Dr. McCarty, or to any of the panelists, last year, one of our fires called the East Troublesome Fire, which is the second largest we've had ever. The thing that was most disturbing about it was growing at about 4,000 or 5,000 acres a day. And then in one day, grew by 120,000 acres, and we lost some lives. And it was up in it was part of Rocky Mountain National Park and near Grand Lake. I mean, how can we use science to predict when there's going to be an explosion like that in terms of fighting wildfires?
My quick answer to that is, in addition to these fire weather models that Dr. Clements has mentioned, we actually do need better, higher resolution, not just fuels mapping, but fuels condition down to the hour. This could be used by incident command, and then that would tell us where would we likely see these types of explosive forest fires. And again, Mr. Geisler has mentioned working with British Columbia. They had a similar situation in 2017. And the Canadian Forest Service is working towards a similar process. So I will defer to the other panelists.
Yeah, Mr. Geisler, could you follow up on that and kind of explain your experience?
Actually, as was said, there are a number of monitoring systems that are looking at fuels and other predictive data in order to give us that heads up. The Mesonet that Representative Lucas talked about has fuels data in real time as a part of it. So we were able to actually look at the moisture content and fuel typing at all of these sites across the entire state at any given moment. And so what it does is it allows the fire manager to anticipate. Just this past year, we had a wind event which took us from a slow fire season to our historic fire season in a matter of a couple of days. And a lot of that really came down to we knew that the wind event was going to occur, but being able, while the wind event was ongoing, to have that ongoing realization of changes would have been another assistance. So there are various systems that are in place that allow this prediction to go, but they just don't have the coverage to really give a national or a regional picture. They're highly isolated at this point.
Okay, thank you. My time's expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I believe we have no additional members available to ask questions. So before we bring this hearing to a close, I want to thank the witnesses for the time they spent with us today, their expertise, their testimony. It's been enormously helpful to us as we think about what further steps we should take here in the Science Committee. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members or any additional questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. And we do ask witnesses, if we have questions, if you could please answer them, if possible, within that 2-week period, that we would be enormously grateful. So at this point, the witnesses are excused with our thanks, and this hearing is now adjourned.